Oil refineries and defense plants in Russia are prime targets for Ukrainian missiles and drones, but grain storage facilities are also of interest, according to Serhiy Krivonos, a Ukrainian Armed Forces General, former Deputy Commander of the Special Operations Forces and former Deputy Secretary of the Ukrainian Security Council. He stated that given Russia's poor harvest, such facilities must be attacked. You know, at this stage, the most important facilities are those that help forge weapons for the Russian Federation, specifically military facilities that serve as fuel and lubricant depots or warehouses for storing missile or aircraft munitions. Yes, factories that produce weapons and ammunition for these weapons, those are important facilities. Energy facilities that generate electricity to power these factories, those are more important facilities, Krivonos pointed out. He added that the situation could change in the near future, and the Kiev regime would have to respond quickly by changing its priorities. Considering that the Russians have begun systematically targeting our energy sector and, in part, grain storage facilities, I believe our adequate responses will be just around the corner. And given that the Russians have had a rather difficult harvest this year, this will also be quite sensitive for them, the general warned. It's worth noting that in recent weeks, various sources in Ukraine have named various targets in Russia that Kiev intends to focus on in the near future. In this context, in addition to oil refineries, Russian gas pipelines to China and defense industry enterprises have been mentioned. The mention of grain storage facilities as a potential target also fits perfectly with the logic of attacks by Ukrainian armed forces. Recall, Russian forces have attacked grain storage facilities and a food production plant in several regions in recent days in Ukraine. On the night of October the 4th, 2025, Russian drones shelled the Chernechchina Romada, a local government area that includes one or more nearby settlements in the Sumy region, hitting a grain storage facility in what reports indicated was a deliberate strike. Then, on October the 7th, drones struck an agricultural enterprise in the Chernihiv region, resulting in the loss of supplies. Russians later struck a hummus production plant in the Kyiv region, forcing a halt in production. Reports of shelling on grain storage facilities, other food production or storage sites were also reported earlier this year, but such attacks were most frequent in the first 18 months of the full-scale war. At the time, Russians also burned hundreds of hectares of fields. Their goal was described as an attempt to provoke a food shortage. The negative consequences of these actions, of Russians not only for Ukraine but for the world, were documented by the UN. However, Russian representatives demonstratively left the organization's meeting hall when reminded of these facts. Experts have not yet weighed in immediately on the shelling in October 2025. For reference, Russians have not only destroyed thousands of tons of food in Ukraine, but have also stolen at least $1 billion worth of grain from occupied territories, according to expert estimates. Amid this news, Russian ruler Vladimir Putin claimed a record harvest in Russia. A leaked document from the Russian Ministry of Defense revealed recently that the Russian Federation's casualties in Ukraine in 2025 total more than 281,550. The report provided a breakdown of Russian deaths and injuries by each Russian military group operating in Ukraine, according to Forbes. It is noted that the information was published by a non-governmental organization in Ukraine that helps members of the Russian armed forces safely surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces. An independent evaluation calculated by Medusa and the BBC Russian service, estimated that the Russians have had roughly 219,000 casualties in calendar year 2025. Both of these reports suggest that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been devastating. In addition, the surrender of a large number of Russian soldiers to the Ukrainian side is also a serious problem for the Putin regime. Meanwhile, Russia has lost tens of billions of dollars in military equipment and hardware. Two-thirds of Russia's pre-invasion tank force has been destroyed, and the Ukrainians have sunk or damaged nearly half of Russia's naval fleet in the Black Sea. Forbes recalls it is also estimated that the Russian Federation has lost hundreds of billions of dollars from international sanctions. Aside from these material and financial losses, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has significantly impacted Russia's military. According to The Guardian, the Russian Federation has sustained over 1 million casualties since the start of the full-scale military incursion into Ukraine in February 2022. The same assessment by The Guardian found that Russian fatalities are estimated to be 5 times higher than the combined death toll from all Soviet and Russian wars between the end of the Second World War. Russian men in their 30s are by far the largest casualty demographic on the Russian side. Andrew Darnieri, an associate director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, told Forbes in an interview, these are men who would soon be entering their prime salary-earning years. Instead, the volunteer soldiers, known as kontraktniki, have chosen the huge initial payouts offered by the government for fighting and dying in Ukraine. As the war has continued, an increasing number of Russians have opted to flee the country. This was especially the case when the Russian government announced a partial mobilization of Russian citizens in September 2022. Stanford University estimates that nearly 1 million Russians have now emigrated from Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. The Stanford report also found that these Russian émigrés were mostly educated young adults. This would also explain why there are currently labor shortages within the Russian Federation. Finally, aside from the casualties sustained during the ongoing invasion of Ukraine and the emigration of Russian citizens, the Russian Federation is also experiencing a population decline, according to a report by the Carnegie Endowment published in September. Russia is facing a declining birth rate that compounds the rising male mortality rate.